reached out is I'm currently working in organizational learning and development myself. However, I just feel that what I'm experiencing is it's just non-impactful and not really useful. They're just kind of just doing education, not learning. And it's honestly, it's kind of eating at my integrity every day that I'm taking part in something that's not really helping in any way whatsoever. Part of the reason that when I looked at your profile, it really jumped out is I've been looking at the work of a guy, I don't know if you may know him, called Nick Shackleton-Jones.
Yeah, that's why I think you mentioned, what did you just say, training and learning? Or education and learning, yeah. So that's his framing, and I take a little bit of exception to that. But yeah, I've known Nick for, I don't know, 4 or 5 years. We've been on podcasts together where we were supposed to debate our differences, and it's really mostly semantics.
Okay.
And but anyway, so yeah, and that's been my experience for my 40 plus years in the business. Is just, the differences are to a large extent semantics, but there are some fundamental differences too, and I think we can talk a little bit about that. The difference between training and education, both to me fall under the umbrella of learning. You know, I can learn from awareness, you know, get an awareness level. I can get an education. I can go through training, and to me, that's all about learning. So the way some people, including Nick, use the word learning is trying to differentiate it from education, and but this is an age-old issue because in the mid-'80s, the late Robert F. Mager, Bob Mager, who's pretty famous in the field going back into the 60s. But anyway, so he announced to an NSPI, now ISPI conference, he was a keynote speaker, and he said, "Why are we still arguing about the difference between education and training? You already know the difference," he said. He said, imagine your kid goes off to college and writes home, this being the mid-'80s, and says they're taking a sex education course. Or they write home and say that they're taking a sex training course. Well, the whole room erupted, and he said, see, you already know the difference. So in a nutshell, training includes an educational component where we're teaching, you know, theories and concepts and models and ways to think about things. But training differs because it adds on, okay, now let's apply that to something that's authentic for you in your work. And I think that's the issue with most learning and development organizations, and before when they were called training and development organizations. And this was a big deal before I got into the business in 1979. This has been an issue going back into the 60s and probably earlier. But most training wasn't training. It was education. And it's called training. And either it made you generally aware of something or gave you deeper knowledge and educated you on something. But too often it was missing. And now here's how to apply that stuff. Behaviors, competencies, topics, skills. And all of this is general. And even today, the whole skills mania is all about learning skills, but it's in a vacuum. It's in a vacuum of that skill in isolation from performance or processes or what's nowadays known as workflow. All the same things, performance, processes, and workflow. It's, the work that people do to get things done, to produce outputs of value to meet stakeholder requirements. And that's when you get a positive outcome, when you meet stakeholder requirements. If you don't meet all the stakeholder requirements, then you're going to get a negative outcome. And that kind of brings me to, people talk about, don't focus on the outputs, focus on the outcomes. Well, when they talk about that word outcome, this is all tricky. This, again, goes back to, it's always semantics. Outputs, and when people are talking about it that way, that's the training or learning output, the program, the module, the this, the that, the job aid, the performance support thing. They're thinking, don't focus on that, focus on the outcomes. Yeah, so when I talk about outputs, it's the result of a process where a bunch of tasks are performed and an output is produced and then handed off downstream to the downstream customer, if you will, to, whether you're providing a service like mowing somebody's lawn or producing a widget or a phone or something, it's the customer, but they're just one of the stakeholders, the downstream customer. And so when I think, I learned to begin with the end in mind and focus on what's the output we're trying to help people produce. And how do you know a good one from a bad one? What are the stakeholder requirements? Well, that begs the question, who are the stakeholders? Well, there's the downstream customer. That's the most obvious. But how about all those regulatory agencies? And some regulatory agencies care about the output, and that's all they care about. They don't care about the tasks or the process or the workflow. They don't give a damn about that. They care about that output. That's their singular focus. There's other regulatory agencies and, that would focus on the process. They don't care about the output. They want to know, did you violate the child labor laws? Did you dump toxic waste into the water systems here? And we don't care what you made. We care about how you made it. And then there's other stakeholders, other regulatory agencies that care about both the output and the process, the workflow, the performance of people. Was it done safely, et cetera? And so if we don't begin with the end in mind, that there's an output to be produced and there's a whole bunch of stakeholders regarding that output and the process used to produce it, if we don't begin with that, then when we talk about behaviors, this behavior, that behavior, these tasks, it's these competencies, these skills, if we don't have the performance in mind, then we can only go so far. Then we can only produce educational content at best. We might have a practice exercise, but it's phony baloney. It doesn't reflect well enough, authentically enough, what the learner has to do back on the job, how they are supposed to apply what they've just learned back on the job. So very often, these educational programs that were called training or learning or something, they don't include practice with feedback, and not just one and done practice with feedback, but enough practice with feedback sufficiently to hone whatever that capability is, that performance capability, that performance competence. And so that's where, most people, I was in corporate America in 2 different companies before I became a consultant. When I became a consultant, we just wouldn't take on any project that didn't include us doing analysis about, what's the terminal performance that we expected. And if we have a large, broad audience and, they have to apply this in hundreds of different ways, well, then all you can do is education. But then you could also train the supervisor on how to take Guy, who just learned this thing, and guide him in applying it in his workplace. So there's a formal part, and then there's a social part, less formal, more informal, to the learning that Guy needs in order to be able to master his job back on the job. So when we don't do analysis or discovery or whatever we need to call it, because, analysis paralysis is a bad thing. So we shy away from that word. Our customers hate that word. I had clients at Motorola back in 1981 who told me, Guy, we hate it when people like you come back to us 90 days later and tell us what we told you on day 1. And that just suggested to me that they'd had some pretty bad experiences with my peers going and conducting analysis efforts that ended up in analysis paralysis. Whatever was produced wasn't clear in terms of, we're going to teach Guy how to weld that widget to this other widget and create a third widget, and that's what we're going to do. And we can tell, there's a quality, quantity, and cost aspect of that, or better, faster, and cheaper, in layman's terms, to Guy being able to do that. And the output is important, and how he does it is important. And if he takes too long to do it, if he takes, instead of 20 minutes, he takes 4 hours, so that's what we need to focus on. What are the requirements there for that process to produce that output? And if we're not clear on that, then we've done a disservice to our clients and to the learners, in that we're not going to really impact performance. So we have to, measure engagement and, some happiness factors or whatever that are so disconnected from the real world of work that, we end up getting a bad reputation, and then that just simply gets worse and worse over time. And, it ends with a lot of frustration. So to me, that's not the fault of a learning and development practitioner. It's the fault of their leadership. And if the learning and development leadership isn't demanding a performance impact and putting in the philosophies and the processes and the practices necessary for that, well, then it's their fault. But then I'd look at the enterprise leadership and say, hey, it's your fault that you're investing in this learning and development function. You got leaders in there who aren't leading and getting an impact, and it's on them. As the late W. Edwards Deming, the quality guru from back in the 40s and 50s and 60s, et cetera, into the 70s, he said it's not the individual. The major problems that industry is trying to solve are not due to individual performance or to team performance. It's due to the system. And the system is in control by management, not the individual practitioners. And he has this famous red bead experiment where, if you watch videos of it, he'd have people doing this red bead experiment, and then he would yell at them for being incompetent because they were dipping a paddle into a bowl of white and red beads. They'd be coming up with red beads. It was unavoidable. You'd always almost come up with red beads. And so he would yell at them for coming up with red beads. And all it was a big demonstration of, we're putting blame on people who have no control over, get the red beads out of the bucket, and then we won't come up with any red beads. So that's a systems problem and not an individual performance problem or a knowledge and skill problem. But anyway, so that's my long way of talking about, so Nick Shackleton Jones, I read his book. It took me, I told him this on some video that we did together. I said, it took me a long time to figure out what green trainers were, because you kept on talking about green trainers in this book. And I'm thinking, what the heck is it? I couldn't figure it out. Later on, I realized, that's what we call running shoes in America, or gym shoes, or tennis shoes. We didn't call them trainers, but that's the semantics of it. And so he's differentiating learning, and he's displacing the word training with learning, and tries to differentiate that from education. Well, education is learning too. So when we in the business talk about these things and our clients aren't tuned into the nuances of our meanings for words, then we miscommunicate most of the time. So, but this has been this was going on in 1979, on day one when I joined a training organization out of college. This was a huge issue, is that we talk past each other. We use a word to mean different things. We use different words to mean the same thing, and it's just a mess. And people new coming into the field have to figure all that stuff out, because we don't have some industry-wide, worldwide authority that says, this is the word, this is what it means, no more, no less. And if you start, and it's sometimes confused with these other words, which may have these meanings, and so let's create a glossary of terms and let's all stick to it. Well, we don't have any of that, because we've had too many competing authority groups like ATD, which used to be ASTD, and ISPI, which used to be NSPI, and a whole bunch of conferences in America and elsewhere in the world. They had similar kinds of issues. But a lot of it goes back to what Bob Baker so clearly pointed out to everybody in, I think it was 1985. You already know the difference between training and education. Sex training is a little bit different than sex education. And so the learning how to apply the educational components is what's often missing. Does that make sense? Does that, have any questions about that?
No, I think a lot of what you've said there is what I've been kind of reflecting on with what's happening in my current situation, and exactly what you said about the leadership and the enterprise leadership. I feel like I'm taking crazy pills. They either don't have a clue or they know and they don't care. They just like certificates.
Yeah, that is so, so again, it goes back to the enterprise leadership. What are their expectations? Do they even know any better? I mean, if they don't know that training is inherently different than education or whatever words are being used in your context, then they don't know how to expect that. But if you used examples such as a car mechanic or a welder, I worked on the Alaska pipeline. I had a project up in the oil fields at Prudhoe Bay back in '87, and in '94 we had a big project on the pipeline, the 800-mile pipeline itself. And some of the big things are the welding. You have to have good welds, otherwise you're going to have a big spill, and then all the government agencies in the state and the country come after you, and it's a nightmare. So if you just used education and never had a welder pick up a welding torch, and you just relied on educating them, telling them all about it and the history of welding included, and nonsense like that, but if they didn't start doing welding and have somebody tell them that was a good one, but you did this wrong and you got to do that, you need feedback. You need corrective feedback when you didn't do it quite right. You need reinforcing feedback that tells you, yeah, you did that well. And feedback is usually a mix of reinforcing and corrective feedback when a learner is first learning how to apply something. And so and the best training of all is, one-on-one coaching, but that's not scalable if you have large audiences and use short time frames and all of that. So we can package up a lot of the components of learning, the educational components, and give them to people on videos or readings or whatever. But the practice with feedback is the toughest thing, and that's what's even harder to scale, almost at times impossible to scale. Now, with the advancements in technology, et cetera, someday the machine will be able to tell me that was a good weld, except when you did this one part here, do that over again for me. Do it 3 times. In fact, I want to see you do it again. And now, Guy, you tell me what you're doing and how this is different than when you were doing it right, and I'll tell you whether or not you got it. And so those days may be coming, but right now, that's hard. So in your case, it's hard to be a prophet in your own land. And, you speaking to your leadership and helping them to see if this could be different. Well, that's risky. Making changes when, rocking the boat, making changes when everybody's pretty happy with a whole bunch of certificates that say people went through this and they went through that. Oh, isn't that wonderful? If that's how we're keeping score, then they're less likely to want to see a change. Now, you working with a stakeholder group or a stakeholder customer might be able to change and do something that's more training-like than educational-like. And they may see the value and difference in that. And they might tell their friends in the business, and their friends in the business come and ask for you and only you because everybody else does, crap. And they want you because you had an impact to the people that you trained or that had learned stuff, and they are doing work better, faster, and cheaper. And all of a sudden now there's a groundswell, and then someday your leadership comes to you and asks you to teach everybody else how to do it too. And, but that could be a forever and a day away, and so it may never happen. And so you have to make a decision as to whether or not you need to seek happiness elsewhere. Look for new employer, or put out your own shingle and become a consultant and sell something that's different. Now, this is frustrating to a lot of people, but I always tell people, look at this as an advantage. Everybody else is doing the same old stuff, and you're going to do it differently, and you can show impact if you only get your first project, and you can show here's where they were when they started. They were doing it this in terms of better, faster, and cheaper. Here's the metrics. Here's the numbers. And post-learning, post-training, here's where they were. 6 days later, 6 weeks later, 6 months later. And, are you interested in something like that rather than the same old, certificate kind of a thing? And but it's tough. In your world, it may not be easy to change jobs or to put up a shingle and become a consultant. I don't know, but unless you can find an internal customer to be a champion for a different way of doing learning, to do performance-based learning, performance-informed learning, again, a whole bunch of names for the same thing, that's just tough. And you either have to accept your lot in life and, like Sisyphus, push the rock up to the top of the hill only to show it roll back down and you start all over again. But so that's, it's not easy to break free, but there are ways to do it inside the current situation. And sometimes there's just no way to do it inside the current situation. And you need to find yourself a new situation where they want to do something a little bit differently. And I think a lot of the world, back in 2014, I wrote this article about, are we finally getting a performance orientation? It kind of looks and sounds and feels like it, but I'm wary. I kind of doubt it, because doing this new approach, which isn't new at all, this performance-based approach, requires doing an adequate analysis effort before design and before development. And in fact, one of my books is about doing analysis in all of the phases of a project. When you do intake, you're doing analysis. When you're doing analysis, you're doing analysis. When you're doing design, you're still doing analysis. When you're doing development, you're still doing analysis. And if you pilot test what you produce before you release it on the world, you're doing analysis then. It's only when you've packaged it up, put it in the LMS, and everybody starts using it or whatever, where your next analysis is it being used? If not, why not? Do we have feedback from the learners that say this is just education and not training? I was looking for training because I don't know how to apply what you've taught me. And that's part of the analysis too. But so if we need to use the word discovery or something else, in many of my engineering clients, they had a name for analysis. It was a box in their ADDIE-like model that said customer requirements. Because we got to figure out what the customer's requirements are, damn it. Otherwise, we're going to screw up and we're going to end up spending more money and we're going to have a negative profit margin. And if we do that often enough, we're going to bankrupt the company. So we call it customer requirements. And we get a project, we figure out the customer requirements, we may do a prototype, and then we do the real deal, however that works, whatever business they're in. So most businesses have something akin to analysis where you figure out, you begin with the end in mind. What is it we want when the dust settles? What is it that people should be able to do? What's the deliverable of the workflow? Because people are in workflows, not just for the purposes of doing work, but they're there to produce an output, a worthy output that meets those stakeholder requirements, and that leads to positive outcomes. So I don't know, how much to what you can do, but but those are, sometimes really difficult decisions to make and to go. But if you're that unhappy, then perhaps that's your best option. I don't know.
Yeah, I am trying to formulate an escape plan of sorts, but I'm lucky that I've got a few allies in different departments, and I'll see what can come from that.
Yeah, so I think you can, talk to people about, the next time you have a project or you think that they might have a need, there's usually two situations here. There's new hires that need training because they don't know how to do the job, because they're new, so they don't know. So then we need to give them training. And maybe we need to give them education because of their previous experiences in education. They know a lot. We just need to give them some information, and maybe they're good to go. But normally not. Normally we need to put training in place where people practice with feedback and they go out the job. It all depends on what are the risks and the rewards at stake. If guy screws up, is it a big deal or no? It's no big deal at all. He just does it over again a couple of times and then it's fine. Okay, then we don't need to worry about those situations. Informal learning would be okay for that situation. Ask your neighbor, guy, and you'll figure it out. Good luck. And but so we need to look for those situations that aren't just a new hire, where there's a performance problem. This is where the gold could be, because the clients recognize that they have a performance problem and they want to throw some training at it because that sounds like a good deal, and then we're good to go. It's off of my shoulders and onto yours, and that's when you're in a better position to demand nicely. Doesn't even sound like a demand, but demand suggests, encourage, that you are given a chance to talk to people who are doing the job at a proficient level right now, so we can train other people to be like that person. And that makes sense. So, you want okay, so then I can talk to them, and maybe if there's more, then I can talk to many more, because maybe the performance context is some people do this work inside the building in air conditioning. Some people do it out in the desert when it's 125 degrees out, and it's or it's freezing cold and it's 60 degrees below zero and there's snow and sleet. So there's different contexts, different environments, and maybe how you do the work varies depending on that. So maybe you need to talk to different experts who are expert at the performance, at the workflow, and capture their secrets of success and teach or train others to be just like them. And a lot of clients might go, yeah, we have 2 or 3 people that really do a fabulous job and everybody else sucks. And so, that kind of makes sense. Who do we want to have somebody, teaching batting practice in American baseball? Somebody who isn't a good batter, or somebody who's a good batter. Now, just because somebody's good at something doesn't mean that they can teach it. That's been demonstrated by research. But a good performance analyst, an instructional analyst, can tease out what is needed. And they don't rely singularly on what people say they do. They go observe them doing it. Because what the research has shown since the 70s or earlier is that experts, and this has to do with cognitive task analysis too, but experts will tell you what they do. And regarding the behavioral tasks, the physical things that we can see, we can count, we can measure, they're pretty close with that. They only miss maybe 25, 30% of those. Because it's like driving a car. You're on automatic pilot. You're not thinking about, well, I do this, I do that, and I never get out of the driveway because I'm thinking about all the things I have to do. No, you're just doing it. And so experts have automated a lot of their knowledge. And so when you ask them a question, well, their egos demand that I'm an expert, so I got to tell you, but I'm going to give you partial information. So it's good to talk to another expert and figure out, Guy said this, but now the next person says some other things that fold in and giving me a more complete picture of what are the things that he and she do to get the job done, to produce those outputs. And that then that's what I call the behavioral tasks, the things that we can see, we can count, we can measure them. But then there's the cognitive tasks, the thinking tasks that happen before, during, and after the behavioral tasks. Because before I light that torch on the welding thing, I'm thinking about, is it safe to do this, or am I going to blow myself up? No, I think it's safe to do this. Okay, now I'm doing this. Now I'm lighting the torch. Now I'm handling it carefully. So I'm thinking about what I'm doing before, during, and after the doing. And if we don't give the learners guidance on how to think about the things that they do, then they're going to have to figure that out on their own. And there's been a lot of noise, if you will, about informal learning. Most learning happens on the job. Well, yeah, because most of the training wasn't training, it was education. We didn't tell them how to do it, how to apply it. We didn't tell them how to think about it. So they're out there on the job figuring it out on their own, and they're going, yeah, I learned how to do most of that out there on the job, not in the training course. So it's partially a reflection on the poor practices of the learning and development function, in that what they produced, their output, was insufficient. it didn't address how to apply this, and not only how to apply this step by step, but how to think about it step by step. And so the cognitive task analysis is really, really critical. When somebody goes on a sales call, one of the first things they have to do is figure out, who am I talking to? Are they in a good mood or are they in a bad mood? Because what I do depends on whether they're in a good mood or in a bad mood, or whether they called me and wanted me to come in and sell them something, or whether I'm pushing and trying to get them to pay attention. All those variances in the performance context have to be accounted for. And I, the performer, need to vary my performance based on the environment, the context that I'm in. So if you called me up and said, hey, come sell me on your training stuff, that's different than if you said, well, I don't have any time, but come on in and I'll listen to your crap. And okay, so now, so I'm entering into two different kinds of situations. One is opening and accepting. The other one is rejecting me already. And so how I, start my sales spiel, varies slightly because of how I've read the room, how I've read the situation. And teaching somebody, how to read the room, how to read the situation, how to read the answers that people gave you. Were they short and curt, or were they, free flowing? And, so that's all part of then what do I do second and third and fourth and fifth? If I'm following some sort of a mental model process about how I should behave in a sales call. And so if you've got internal clients, potential clients inside the company, you just need to look for a champion, and you need to go for that one win where you can do something that's really performance-based, performance-oriented, performance-informed, and includes a sufficient amount of practice with feedback. In my designs, when I talk about this stuff, and it's in a bunch of my books, when I talk about practice with feedback, I call them application exercises. And I give people information, then I give them a demonstration. Okay, this is how, when you apply that information, this is what it looks like. So I demystify it. Then I say, pay attention to that demonstration, because that's what you're going to be doing next in the application exercises, the practice with feedback. So info, demo, appo, apply it. I'm going to tell you, I'm going to show you. Now you show me back that you can do it. And I'll give you feedback and help you along the way. And when we do application exercises, I have a framework for 4 levels. The first one is easy peasy, just to demystify it, to take the scariness out of it if possible, because people are threatened when we ask them to apply what they've learned, because they don't want to be wrong in front of their peers, in front of the instructors. I mean, it may be a career killer, etc. So we've got to look for ways to take the threat out, take the fear out of the situation. So I just make it an easy one that's, 1, 2, 3. It's as simple as, okay, now we got that. Now we'll throw in a couple of monkey wrenches, make it a little bit more difficult, a little bit more challenging. So I go from an easy peasy exercise to a difficult exercise. And then the next exercise is darn difficult. And the fourth one is from Hades, from hell. It's everything that could go wrong. Because sometimes we're trying to prepare people for that, because they're not going to learn it anywhere else. And if things could go horribly wrong in the performance and the application that we're talking about, and maybe it's rare, but if it's a nuclear power facility and we could blow the city off the face of the earth, well, that's a big deal. So yeah, maybe we should practice more than once. Maybe we should practice more than 4 times. Maybe we should practice every other week for the rest of his career, because this is that critical. The stakes are that high, the risks and rewards. And so if we can get a client to buy that, because I had a chance to work with Neil Rackham of spin selling fame. I don't know if you've heard the name or not, but this was back in 81, 82 when I was at Motorola. And one of the things he did in front of my clients is that we were meeting with my manufacturing clients, and these were a gruff bunch. They, they didn't like a little British gentleman with a 3-piece tweed suit with a goatee. They did not like this guy at all, and he read the room correctly. And so he's talking about the importance of practice with feedback, and because I was pushing that, and he knew I was pushing that, and they were resisting. Oh no, you just tell them, they'll figure it out. And so Neil said he got out a little flute, medieval flute, and he started playing. And he said, I'm no good. My instructor says, your fingers are lazy. You don't raise them high enough. And they thought, well, this just sounded melodic. It was beautiful. What do you mean it's no good? And he said, and then Neil said to them, did any of you guys play golf or tennis? They all did. And he said, did you ever take a lesson? They all had. And he said, oh, did the coach ever change your grip on the tennis racket or on the golf club? Oh, yes. And they all were going, oh, yeah. And he goes, so how was your ball control with that new grip? And they go, oh, the ball went everywhere the wrong way. And then he let them calm down. And he said, see, the job of the coach is to reinforce the correct grip, because I bet what you did after you lost ball control is you went back to the old grip because you had some semblance of ball control with the old grip. But you'll never get good with that old grip. You got to get the right grip. And so the job of the coach is to teach you the right grip, and then regardless of where the ball goes, reinforce the behavior of the grip and ignore the results until those results become reinforcing of the new behavior, the new grip. And if they said, okay, no, you let your fingers slide, get that, and get you to give that new grip again, and eventually you get better ball control, and you go, okay, this is great. And then later on, years later, I would say to my clients, I'd tell them the story, and I'd say, Tiger Woods, the world's greatest golfer, this is 20 years ago, the world's greatest golfer, that he has a swing coach? Now, why would Tiger Woods, who makes more money than anybody else on the face of the earth playing golf, why would he have a swing coach? Because he had automated his grip and his stance and then changed it and didn't notice the changes. And he needed a coach there to say, Tiger, this is what you did. Your shoulders are slumping or whatever. And he needed that feedback from a coach, even though he was the world's best golfer, because that's how performance is. People need constant feedback, reinforcing feedback, and corrective feedback in order to maintain behaviors. Now, for a weekend golfer, that's not that big a deal. But if you're making, hundreds of millions of dollars a year golfing, then it is a big deal. And so it's well worth, investing in a coach to give you feedback continuously. Every time you swing the damn club, there's a coach there who's going to give you some feedback between this hole and the next hole, so that when you get to the next hole, you're going to try to get back to the correct grip and the correct stance and all the rest of it. So if you find somebody who's willing to let you take a different approach to learning and go from education into training, these are my old school terms, and to me they make a lot of sense. And watering things down, the training organization. If it wasn't for Peter Senge in his 1990 book, The Fifth Discipline, talking about the learning organization, all my corporate clients, I was working with the Fortune 10 and 20 companies and up to 100. And they all the training and development organizations went from having training in their name to learning. And then we had the advent of e-learning, authoring tools, where anybody can sit down and create a learning package. And so why not ask an expert to do that? They don't know how to construct good learning, good training. They give you, a bunch of everything under the sun when you only needed this much of it. And the rest of it you could learn later on when you were really an expert and you needed to learn a lot more nuances. But on day one, new people need to learn the history of something? No, they probably never even need to learn that. It might be interesting to talk about that at the bar at night with your fellow workers, but you don't need that to go up and perform. With some rare instances where you might. But that's, I think, if you find somebody that is willing to let you do things a little bit differently, you need to find what I call master performers, or others might call star performers or top performers. Again, language is important, and it's also a problem. But we always have traditionally called our sources subject matter experts, SMEs. And that just says we're all about the subject matter. Well, so the late Tom Gilbert, one of the people I learned a lot from back early on, had a book, a 1978 book, Human Competence, and he used the word exemplar. What we wanted was we want to work with exemplars, people who are really the supreme example of a proficient performer. And I was at Motorola and I used the word exemplar, and my manufacturing client said, "Guy, we hate that word. It's a $3 college word," which means $30 college word now. And, so I said, "How about master performer?" And they said, "Yeah, that sounds good." So I want and this was after we had a failure of a project, because they only let me talk to one person. And the business card said corporate subject matter expert in purchasing. And I worked with him, and he had been up at headquarters for 7 years and out of the field for 7 years. So what he gave to me to package in this training program that bombed horribly, and all my clients heard about it, was because everything he gave me was 7 years old, and the world had changed a lot. And it wasn't about performance, because they wouldn't allow me to work with people to figure out, what do purchasing agents produce? What do they do to produce that? They produce contracts, they produce requests for proposals, they produce this, they produce that. So, okay, begin with the end in mind. That's what they produce, a contract or a request for proposal. So what are the steps to producing those things, and how can you tell good, efficient, quality processes, workflows to produce those outputs? And how do you know a good RFP from a bad one? And the guy that I worked with told me what he thought from his experience 7 years earlier and years in the business before that. But it wasn't what was going on today. And so you've got to be careful about when you take on an assignment. You need to negotiate up front. I'm going to need to talk to some of the people that are doing this well. And maybe they're not in the job. Maybe they used to have the job and they got promoted, and they're now some vice president somewhere else who used to have that job back in the day, but they have a sense for that. And maybe I need to talk to the other players in the performance that work with the purchasing agent, or whoever the target is. So the target needs to be on performance. It needs to be on the performers. Sometimes in a business process, there might be 3 or 4 or a dozen performers with different job titles. Sometimes we're trying to teach one job title who's in a process, in a workflow, where there's a whole bunch of other people. And part of what we need to know is who does what. Our target audience doesn't do all of the tasks in the process. They do some of them. And they do some of them by themselves in isolation, and sometimes they're collaborating with others in the process. And so that's what we need to address, is how to do those things in order to produce the output. And even if we trained our person to be a top performer, if other people screw it up, well, then the output is no good, but it's not on our target audience. And so we kind of need to understand the full context of how does that performance go, task by task, step by step, and who's doing those things, and where are the more difficult, trickier tasks where they have a negative impact on the final product. Maybe it's in tasks 5, 7, and 9 out of 27 where if you don't do those pretty much perfectly, the end product suffers. And so, that needs to be where the focus is, and there's less focus on the other things because they're easier. And these other parts are trickier and more. And so that's, we don't have to practice every task in the process. We might have to just practice 5, 7, and 9 where it's really tricky and difficult. And so that's where we need to focus. The other thing I would suggest is that when you're working with a new client that was going to allow you to do this a little bit differently, that you take them along on the journey. They don't have to be joined at the hip with you as you're doing your work, but you need to check in with them and let them know what you're uncovering, what you're discovering, whether the plan to go forward is adequate or whether you need to change it. Maybe talk to a couple other people. Maybe you need to talk to somebody from regulatory affairs, or, because you've uncovered something here that suggests we need to get some more insights and inputs into our project from other people in other departments or functions. There's many rule number ones in the world. One of the rule number one is allow no surprises. So don't let your customer and client get caught by surprises because you uncovered something and the word gets back to them before you gave them that insight. Because the people that you're talking with might say, oh, you've helped me think about this differently. I'm going to tell my boss, who might tell your customer. And because you didn't get back to your customer quick enough to tell them, we discovered what was going on. I had a project with General Dynamics where they build the F-16 jet aircraft fighters for the military. And this was about creating the stealth aircraft. So this was about the composite materials, which are kind of like fiberglass. They're not metal. And then the radar goes right through them instead of bouncing off of them. And that's why, you can't see them coming with radar systems. And so, it's either passes through or it's absorbed. So just the radar hits the jet and absorbed, and it doesn't bounce back, and nobody can see it from using radar. And they were having problems. This was back in 89 or 90. And they were having problems with the parts that were being produced. And the problem was the engineering change notice system wasn't fast enough. The engineers would decide, okay, that didn't work. We got to do this instead. And then that would go into a file system and then be manually processed. Computers were not everywhere back then. But or there was a backlog in the engineering change notice where people would actually change the work orders so that the work orders would tell you what to do differently than last time, and that would be better. It's like changing the standard operating procedures because you realize that, oh, we're having problems because the standard operating procedure, the SOP, is deficient, and we need to fix step 7 because that is wrong, and everything after that is no good. We might as well throw it away at step 8. But we don't. We go all the way to step 100 and invest it. And so what we discovered was that it wasn't the performers where the problem lay. It wasn't in their knowledge and skills because they were dutifully following the work order, which gave them step-by-step instructions and these materials and supplies to go get the job done. And the changes hadn't gone through the process to get back to the work order, so the people were following work orders that pretty much guaranteed that the part would fail. And so because I was taking my client along on that, as soon as I uncovered that, I informed them. And so when others came to them and said, hey, I know why you're having all these problems, and my client was able to say, yeah, it's because the engineering change order system is not correcting the work orders soon enough. So I already knew that. But if they hadn't known that when that came around here, they would have been embarrassed, and then they would have said, you embarrassed me, guy, because I allowed you to do this thing differently here, and it ended up burning me. So I don't know that I want to do that again. So we've got to be very careful when we're dealing with performance problems. New hires, duh, they need training. Let's give it to them, teach them how to do the job. Performance problems, these are trickier, and so now my client, whose department built these composite parts, it wasn't their problem. Everybody at the plant thought it was them, but it was really the engineering department and their engineering change system. And so now the people that ran the engineering change system, they had 27 excuses as to why it wasn't really their fault, but everybody could look at the data that we collected and said, no, it's your fault. You need to resource that differently. You don't have enough people processing the engineering change notices, and that's the problem we're having over here. So the problem over there is causing the problem here, but we're all focused on the here where we can see it. The part failed. It must be the group producing the part, but it wasn't. And so it's when we're dealing with performance problems and that they are high risk, high reward, people are going to get political, they're going to get defensive, they're going to try to avoid taking the blame. Or what the engineering change order notice people in that particular case said is that, yeah, you didn't give me the budget that I requested. I told you I needed twice as many people. And because you didn't give them to me, I'm running behind. So there. So it went all the way up to the executive committee. It was their fault for not giving the resources they needed. But nobody likes having the blame pinned on them. So, it was a whole bunch of, we call this, it's not me, it's somebody else, it's their fault. And when you're dealing with high stakes performance and you're trying to fix a performance problem, you need to enter into those kinds of projects knowing that there are landmines everywhere and that you need to do your best to avoid the landmines and have an attitude of we need to fix the problem, not fix blame. So part of my analysis effort would have been, if they had let me, but they didn't, was to go talk to the engineering change notice people and find out why they didn't, why was there this backlog? And they would have told me, well, we asked for the budget for twice as many people and they didn't give it to us. And, what can you do? And therefore, if I'd written a report up on this, I would have been able to say, this goes back to the funding mechanism for funding these departments because they weren't adequately funded. So there. And it wasn't their fault. Yeah, but that's where the fault lies, but it's not their fault because they weren't in charge of, going around and stealing money from and hiring people, without authorization. The people in that department couldn't fix it because of the system, as Deming called it, was broken. And they hadn't forecasted the workflow, the amount of work, so they could adequately resource the department that was responsible for that work. It was all predictable, as the engineering change notice people said. We told them, we're getting this kind of work, it's getting more, and you're not giving us more resources, more people, more desks, more computers, more whatever we needed to get that done. So we're being inadequately funded. And, that makes our lives a little bit trickier when we're dealing with the politics, especially if we're from the outside. Because if we're an external consultant, then we likely don't have the insight that an internal consultant might have. If they've been around long enough. If they're brand new, then they're climbing the learning curve and trying to figure things out and how they work and all that. But an external consultant, I can always ask the stupid questions and get a smart answer. But if you've been inside the company for a while, you ask a perceived stupid question because you need that answer, and people think you should know that already because you've been here for a while. Well, then you have to take that hit. You got to be willing to be asked the stupid question, because usually the stupid questions are not stupid. They're just embarrassing to the people giving you the answer, because their answers reflect on what's really going on. Where does the gap root cause lie?
Yep.
I don't know if it's been helpful or not. I hope it has been, but
No, it has. I think it's kind of showing the amount of analysis, as you said, that is required, and it's the exact opposite of what's happening now. I'm experiencing what I would call McDonald's training or McDonald's education, where there's just pre-made courses on the menu, and they're given to different stakeholders, and they've been designed completely out of context and time of place of what those people need. Yet they come in and complete it, get the certificate, and then our leadership measures participant response, Kirkpatrick level 1, but they wrap it up as 3 and 4, and the higher ups don't know the difference. By the way, Guy, I think the call might knock us off any second. I think it cuts off at an hour. I'm not sure if it will or not, but it might cut off.
Yeah, so we can do this again sometime if you need to. So this book I mentioned to you before. This is the book. A lot of my books are redundant across them. There's a core part of analysis, and this particular book goes into cognitive task analysis, where my other books didn't really dive deep into it. So my intent with this book was to build upon the earlier books, the one that talks about doing analysis and all the phases, and then doing a lesson map based on that data is another book. And then this one here dives back into, okay, how do you do the thought flow in the workflow, the cognitive tasks within the behavioral tasks, my language, which a lot of people wouldn't like, that's not how you use behavior, but anyway, that's just how I've been using it for a long time.
I think that's definitely something I want to get my hands on. I came across CTA when I was studying human factors, psychology. Have you ever heard of Gary Klein and his research? No. I came across that. We're lucky in the company I'm in. We've got a world-class human factors manager. He's one of my advocates, and he's taught me about this, because human factors is about performance in the environment that you're in.
Exactly. There's a lot of people that are trying to do the same thing that learning and development professionals are trying to do, is have a positive impact on the process, the business processes, human factors, the quality organization, HR, by hiring the right people and putting them in place, the training, learning, and development organizations to train people up on what they don't know when they walked in the door, the payrolls, compensation system, all of that is hopefully trying to help the business processes, perform better and better, faster, and cheaper. And so my source for a lot of the cognitive task analysis, and it's in the book, is a guy named Richard E. Clark. He's professor emeritus from Southern California University. He's been doing this stuff for 30 years. And he told me about this stuff back in the early 2000s, late 1900s. And so this has been a thing that's been studied, but so few people have really addressed that. But there are people doing it. There are people doing good performance-based instruction, training, learning. It's just they're a small sliver in the big picture. There's so many people that are doing mostly education, creating a bunch of content that is educational at best, and sometimes it's really just communications. It's not even education. You're communicating something, you're not really educating somebody on something. And you're including things in the educational content that people don't need in order to be able to perform. It just is overload, cognitive overload, and that's to be avoided. So this, my little note says the call ends in 2 minutes. So, if you, I would suggest that you do some reading on this. If you go to my website, my professional archive website, I've got a bunch of articles and videos that I've done on this topics, all of the things that we've been talking about, and that might be of help to you. And if you need more guidance into what's already there, happy to do that. And if you need to talk again sometime, we can do that.
That sounds great. Well, I always think an hour with a wise person is worth a month in the library. And I think that I've been able to glean a lot of really good insights here. So I will probably take you up on that offer and let you know when that happens. But in the meantime, I will get the book and read your website.
Very good. All right. Thank you. And send me a copy of the video.
Will do. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.
All right. Bye-bye.
Take care.